Hello folks, I'm Trev Makes It Easy, the channel where we make learning easy. In this series, Trev on Econ, I'll be taking you through topics you're likely to run into in any introductory course in economics at the college or university level. My goal is to make economics less scary, more approachable, and, if I can, mildly enjoyable. With that being said, let's make it easy. All right, folks, let's dive into lesson 4. So building off of our last lesson where we talked about trade-offs, we're going to look at what is considered sort of the Great Tradeoff. And this one is one that societies have to deal with at all times. Depends how you want to structure things, depends how you want to run things. At the end of the day, a lot of our decisions, both politically, economically, really in almost all facets of life, come down to this trade-off. And it is, as the name suggests, efficiency versus equity. Now, before we talk about why those are trade-offs, we should define what those are. And there are various definitions we could use, especially for equity, but we're going to come up with some fairly basic definitions that are going to allow us to argue this point a little without getting into too much of a philosophical argument. So efficiency is what the English definition is. It is the idea of getting the most value from your scarce resources. So the idea here is that we know we have limited resources. We have this issue of scarcity. So when I'm choosing how to allocate my resources, I want to do them in the most valuable way possible. I want to get the most in return for what I spend. You'll sometimes see the English phrase bang for your buck, right? Basically getting the most value for that which you use. And this is perfectly fine to chase after, right? We're going to talk a lot about this today, but economics isn't huge on the idea of good and bad. Those are very morality-based things, which we can start to introduce a little bit, but they get very opinionated very quickly. Now, on the other end, we have equity, and this one is where you can get into a very real debate about what it means to be equitable. But for our purposes, we are going to say this is just a fair/just system, right? And we're going to argue from a basic principle that everyone gets an equal share, right? Now, again, we could argue this being instead of an equal share, everyone gets what they need to be on an equal level, or it could be everyone gets what they need to succeed or be comfortable. We can really split hairs on this one, which makes it tricky, but we're going to keep a fairly basic definition at this point just to make it understandable. Now, the problem with efficiency and equity is they both seem like good ideas. I think all of us would like to have as much value as we can from our time, our effort, our energy. But we'd also like to provide equality, all right, equity, where we're being fair, people are getting what they deserve, what they need, whatever the case may be. I think they're both very noble ideals. The problem is it's very hard to have one without sacrificing the other to some degree. So here's a classic example I like to use in my classroom. Imagine you have $100,000. This is, you've won a lottery, someone died, you've got some money. And you're faced with the decision of how to use that money, right? It's a scarce resource, a little less scarce now, which is nice, but it's a scarce resource. And in front of you are two people willing to take your investment. You have a CEO who has run multiple companies successfully, sold them off, done a great job, and you have some high school kid who's kind of a burnout, maybe not super interested in a bunch of things, sits around, plays video games, kid stuff, whatever they want to do. In terms of splitting up that money, we basically are arguing about this efficiency versus equity notion. Because if I want to be purely efficient, I think the correct choice would be to give all my money to the successful business person and get the most return I can. The problem? Well, now I've left this other person with absolutely nothing, and there's now this wealth disparity, right? There's this wealth gap where I have the haves and the have-nots. So I've really hurt the equity issue here. Rewind that. I have my $100,000 again. Now I want to be very equitable. So I give 50,000 to the business person. I give 50,000 to the teenager, and I've been equal, right? Everyone got the same amount. Everyone's happy. However, I'm really not being efficient because that business person can not do as much as they want to. They're still going to get me my value, but really only on the 50,000 I gave them. Whereas the teenager, they might provide some value, but there's a high chance they're not going to use that money as wisely. So while I've chased equity, I've sacrificed efficiency. So I end up with this sort of scale system where the more efficiency I get, the less equity I get, and the more equity I get, the less efficiency I get. And the world tends to revolve around balancing these out in a meaningful way. What fits your society, what fits your culture, etc. Now, we're going to apply this to a more economics type issue, and that is how we structure markets. So before we structure markets, we have to talk about markets. And a market is a simple thing we use all the time in economics, and it is simply a meeting of sellers and buyers. Now, brief history lesson. Obviously, the term market comes from the olden days where there was like a market square in the town, and people would have to come to the market square. They would meet up, they'd buy and sell their cows, their carrots, whatever they're doing, and that was the market. Now, in the modern day, this isn't necessarily needed. We have markets, right? So you have farmers markets or flea markets, those kinds of things. Walmart is a market. There's buyers and sellers there, the buyer being you, the seller being Walmart. In fact, this interaction on YouTube is a market, right? I am selling economics knowledge. You don't have to pay for it directly, but you're buying it with your time. All right, you're buying it with your attention. We talked last time about all these costs we can incur, and you are paying these different costs, and I am selling this to you in hopes to maybe educate you, get some sort of benefit for myself, whatever the case may be. Now, how we structure our markets is going to be a discussion of efficiency and equity. We're going to take, again, a very introductory economics approach to this. This topic is far more advanced and complicated and nuanced in reality, but for our purposes, we're going to take a very simplified approach. And to do that, we are going to draw a little spectrum where markets operate on this spectrum. On one end, we are going to have what we call, let's grab a neutral color, a command economy, or sometimes people call it a centrally planned economy. And this is a very controlled economy. In these economies, what happens is an individual or group in power, we'll say, because the power part will matter, make all the economic decisions. So that means they choose what to make, how to make it, who gets it, what is going to be used to make those things. They make every single decision. Now, this is a very extreme case, and again, most economies don't actually fall into this extreme of a category, but this would be something like North Korea. North Korea is probably the poster child of this, where they are very planned. You go to the barber, there's 7 pictures of haircuts, you point to the haircut you want. All right? All decisions are handled by their leader. Now, on the opposite end, we end up with something called a market economy. Now, some people confuse with like capitalism and communism. Those are more political ideologies. These are more economic ideologies. But in a market economy, the power of economic decision-making is spread to the people. All right. So in this case, it's households and firms that make all the economic decisions, right? We're going to see the term household and firms a lot, especially whenever we cover microeconomic topics. The firms and households are going to be a major part of that study. Now, who falls into this category? Well, again, your best example is probably the United States. All right. They are probably the most market economy. Even then, are they perfectly market? No, because the government will intervene. They will make policy and do things to curtail certain activities. Just like North Korea is probably not perfectly command, there are probably some small niche pieces that people are able to choose themselves. Probably not many, but a lot. Now, if we compare North Korea and the US, I think most people understand that those are very, very different worlds. All right, same planet, different realities. But if we go back to the first topic of efficiency versus equity, they're basically just chasing opposite ends of that dichotomy. The market economy, something like US, has spent years, decades trying to be as efficient as possible. It's been very good to them, right? They've had a lot of economic success because of that. And their trade-off has been equity. There are definitely issues in the US, such as wage disparity, gender disparity, race disparity, all sorts of issues that a lot of people would find unjust or unfair. And that might be a byproduct of chasing efficiency for so long. Now, in recent years, there's been some movement to try and balance those scales out. But I think on the whole, the US has been a more efficiency driven economy. And again, I don't want to say if that's good or bad. We'll talk about that in a second. On the opposite end, if we look at North Korea, their efficiency, maybe not so great. Okay. Are they an economic powerhouse? Not really. They have some trade partners and they deal in very specific things, usually weaponry, and that has its whole own connotations. But what's the equality like, or the equity? Well, it's actually really high, right? Everyone's fairly equal, except for those in like superpower, but the vast majority of the population is on the same level, right? Everyone gets a job, everyone gets paid, everyone eats. It's got a very equitable aspect to it. Again, am I saying that's a good or bad thing? I really don't know. Okay. And that kind of introduces a kind of a little subtopic here, which is I've mentioned before, I don't love saying good or bad in economics because a lot of the stuff is gray in the sense that we don't have things that are purely good and purely bad. That's morality based, which is subjective to some degree. And in most bad things, you can find some good, and in most good things, you can find some bad. All right. Nothing is purely one or the other. So, for example, if we look at the US has a lot of great things, right? Land of opportunity. You can make a living doing pretty much anything, right? Especially with the advent of social media. There's lots of wonderful things about the US, but it's not perfect, right? There's a lot of negatives too. Again, a lot of these inequalities I've talked about, social injustice, poverty, whatever the case may be, there are some obvious downsides. If we flip the script to North Korea, you could do the same thing there as well. I think the downsides are a little more pronounced, right? A lot of people don't want to live that hyper-controlled lifestyle. There's a lot of punishment if you don't abide by the rules of society and the cultural norms that are expected of you. And it's generally, like, from what we've heard from people who have left North Korea, maybe not the most enjoyable place to live. However, again, not all things are bad. What about the crime rate? Crime rate in North Korea is probably incredibly low because you get severely punished if you do a bad thing, right? You are guaranteed a job, to my knowledge. Again, I don't know the inner workings of North Korea, but there are some equitable actions in North Korea that are probably a good thing. Again, think about how many decisions you have to make on a daily basis. Wouldn't it be nice if some of those got removed and you could just kind of coast through certain things? Again, not for everybody, but there is good and bad in each thing. So market tends to focus on efficiency. Command tends to focus on equity. Again, it's not going to be 100% one way or the other, but that tends to be where they lean. Now the question becomes is, well, what about all this dead space in the middle? Well, in the middle, we have what we usually call mixed economies. These are the groups that we really don't have specific rules for. So this is everyone in between. And really what they do is they take aspects of both command and market economies. Effectively, the way I like to think about it is imagine a buffet. You have a buffet table and there's all these different things. And you basically go through the table and be like, military, I think that should be controlled by the command economy. Food, that should be controlled by the market economy. And you're picking things up and basically putting them in to the style you want. And the goal, I like to believe, is they're trying to make the best society they can. All right. I'm going to use Canada as an example because that's where I'm operating out of. But in Canada, most things are market economy, right? If I want to go buy a car or clothes or food, I get to make that decision. And I have a lot of autonomy in what I buy, right? So again, lot of market economy. Probably Canada is going to be over here somewhere. But there's also things that are command economy in Canada, right? One of our most touted features is free healthcare. Free healthcare is very much a command economy thing. I don't really get to pick my treatments or my doctors. I kind of get what I get. It has some downsides for sure, like wait times, but I don't have to pay, which is nice. So again, there's a balancing act there. But the idea is the Canadian society or government or economy or whichever group you want to blame has chosen that most things go into the market basket. But some things like healthcare, well, we think it's best if that's centrally planned. And again, I'm not here to say whether that's wrong or right, but it's something interesting to look at. If you're not from Canada, or even if you are from Canada, I encourage you, look at your own country and ask yourself, what aspects of your country lean more towards the market economy and more of an efficiency focus? And which policies or systems or whatever lean more towards that command or centrally planned economy, where we're saying, maybe equity's the better choice, right? I honestly think economies, no matter where they end up on the spectrum, are trying their best to make things better, and that they have some belief system that, or hopefully research that their way is the best way and they're willing to adapt if not. Again, that might be a very idealized version, but you can see that this efficiency versus equity argument is very much the overarching choice or trade-off that we really face in society. I hope that was informative. I'll see you next time. Well, folks, that wraps up another lesson for today. I hope it was helpful. If you found the video valuable, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions about the content or requests for other topics or subjects you'd like me to cover, please leave a comment below. Until next time, keep learning and make it easy.